Black waitress serves disabled man for years, until he hands her his keys and a shocking note. The Bluebird Diner stood on the corner of Maple and Oak Streets, a beacon of warmth and comfort in the small town of Millbrook. Its neon sign flickered in the early morning light, casting a soft blue glow on the rain-slicked sidewalk. Inside, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, mingling with the quiet chatter of early risers. Amelia Johnson, a 35-year-old black woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, tied her apron around her waist as she prepared for another day of serving the people of Millbrook. Her dark curls were neatly pulled back into a practical bun, few strands escaping to frame her face. She'd been working at the Bluebird for nearly a decade, and in that time, she'd become as much a fixture of the diner as the vinyl booths and chrome-edged table. As Amelia began her morning routine, wiping down counters and refilling salt shakers, she glanced at the clock. It was nearly 7 a.m., which meant Mr. Harrison would be arriving soon. A small smile played on her lips at the thought. Right on cue, the bell above the door chimed, and in rolled George Harrison, a 68-year-old man in a motorized wheelchair. His silver hair was neatly combed, and despite the early hour, his blue eyes twinkled with life behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," Amelia called out cheerfully, already reaching for the coffee pot. "The usual?" George's face lit up at the sight of her. "Amelia, my dear." "Yes, please. And how many times do I have to tell you to call me George?" Amelia chuckled as she poured his coffee. "At least once more, Mr. Harrison, as always." This exchange had become a comfortable ritual for them over the years. George had been coming to the Bluebird every morning since Amelia started working there. First, he had been just another customer, but over time, he had become something more: friend, confidant, and in many ways the father figure Amelia had never had. As Amelia brought over George's usual breakfast, 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat toast and a side of fruit, she couldn't help but notice the slight tremor in his hands as he reached for his coffee cup. It seemed to be getting worse lately, but she knew better than to mention it. George had always been fiercely independent despite his disability. "So, what's new in the exciting world of George Harrison?" Amelia asked, leaning against the counter as George took his first sip of coffee. George's eyes twinkled mischievously. "Oh, you know me, Amelia, living life in the fast lane. Yesterday I raced Mrs. Perkins to the mailbox and won by a wheel." Amelia laughed, the sound bright and genuine. It was moments like these that made her job worthwhile. "I'm sure Mrs. Perkins demanded a rematch." "Naturally," George replied with a wink, "but I told her I don't race on Wednesdays. It's my day of rest." As they continued their playful banter, other regulars began to filter into the diner. Amelia greeted each one by name, taking orders and delivering plates with practiced ease. But even as she moved about the diner, she always kept one eye on George, ready to refill his coffee or offer assistance if needed. The morning rush came and went, leaving the diner in a lull. Amelia took the opportunity to slide into the booth across from George, who was now working on a crossword puzzle. 7-letter word for unselfish concern for others, George muttered, tapping his pen against the newspaper. "Altruism," Amelia replied without hesitation. George looked up, a mixture of surprise and admiration on his face. "You know, Amelia, you're wasted here. With a mind like yours, you could be doing anything you wanted." Amelia's smile faltered for a moment. It was a sensitive topic, one they'd discussed before. "I like it here, Mr. Harrison. I like the people, the routine. It's comfortable." George's gaze softened. He reached across the table, his weathered hand covering hers. "Comfortable isn't always good, my dear. Sometimes we need to be uncomfortable to grow." Amelia nodded but didn't respond. She knew George meant well, but he didn't understand. Couldn't understand. As a black woman in a small, predominantly white town, Amelia had learned early on that keeping her head down and doing her job well was the safest path. Ambition, in her experience, often led to disappointment. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of new customers. Amelia squeezed George's hand before standing up. "Duty call. Can I get you anything else?" George shook his head. "No, thank you. I should be heading out anyway. Got a hot date with my physical therapist." He winked, eliciting another laugh from Amelia. As George maneuvered his wheelchair towards the door, Amelia called out, "Same time tomorrow, Mr. Harrison?" "Wouldn't miss it for the world, my dear," he replied, giving her a small wave, before disappearing into the bright morning sunlight. Amelia watched him go, a fond smile on her face. She couldn't have known then how much her life was about to change, or the role George Harrison would play in that change. All she knew was that tomorrow would bring another day, another shift, and another chance to serve the man who had become such an important part of her life. As the day wore on, Amelia found her thoughts continually drifting back to her conversation with George. His words about comfort and growth echoed in her mind as she went about her task. She thought about the dreams she'd once had: college, career and social work, of making a real difference in people's lives. Dreams that had been put aside in favor of the steady paycheck, familiar routine of the diner. It wasn't that Amelia was unhappy with her life. She took pride in her work, in the relationships she'd built with the regular customers, in the small kindnesses she was able to offer each day. But there was a part of her that wondered there could be more. As she wiped down tables and refilled ketchup bottles, Amelia's mind wandered to her younger sister, Tanya. Unlike Amelia, Tanya had left Millbrook as soon as she could, heading off to college in the big city. She was now a successful marketing executive, with a life full of excitement and opportunity. Amelia loved her sister fiercely and was proud of her accomplishments, but she couldn't deny the twinge of envy she felt when Tanya called to share stories of her latest adventures. Afternoon sun streamed through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. Amelia paused for a moment, watching the dust motes dance in the golden light. She thought about George, about the quiet strength he showed every day, facing the world from his wheelchair with humor and grace. She thought about the way he always encouraged her, always saw more in her than she saw in herself. "Order up." Cook's voice jolted Amelia from her reverie. She shook off her thoughts and returned to work, plastering on a smile as she delivered plates and refilled coffee cups. As the day drew to a close and the last customer left, Amelia found herself alone in the diner. She moved through the familiar closing routine, counting the till, wiping down surfaces, setting up for the next day. But tonight, each task felt heavier than usual, weighted down by the thoughts and questions swirling in her mind. Finally, with everything in order, Amelia stepped out into the cool evening air. She paused for a moment, looking up at the stars just beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, beyond the familiar streets of Millbrook, a whole world of possibilities waited. But for now, those possibilities would have to wait. Tomorrow was another day, and George Harrison would be waiting for his coffee and eggs, just like always. As Amelia walked home, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Little did she know how right she was, or how profoundly that change would affect her life. The next few weeks passed in a blur of coffee refills, friendly chatter, and the comforting rhythm of diner life. Amelia found herself looking forward to George's daily visits more than ever, each interaction adding another layer to their growing friendship. One particularly busy morning, as Amelia rushed between tables, she noticed George struggling with his fork. His hands were shaking more than usual, causing the utensil to clatter against his plate. Without hesitation, Amelia made her way over to his table. "Everything all right, Mr. Harrison?" she asked softly, careful not to draw attention. George looked up, a mixture of frustration and embarrassment in his eyes. "Just having a bit of trouble today, my dear. Nothing to worry about." Amelia glanced around the diner, ensuring no one needed her immediate attention, and slid into the booth across from George. "May I?" she asked, gesturing towards his plate. George hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Amelia picked up the fork and began cutting his pancakes into bite-sized pieces. As she worked, she chatted about the weather, local gossip, anything to make the moment feel more normal. "There you go," she said, setting the fork back down. "Now, is there anything else I can get for you?" George's eyes were misty as he looked at her. "Amelia, you are a true angel. Thank you." From that day forward, their bond deepened. George began sharing more about his life, his career as a high school teacher before his condition worsened, his love for classical music, and his passion for gardening, which he still managed from his wheelchair. In turn, Amelia opened up about her own life. She told George about her childhood dreams of becoming a social worker, her struggles as a young black woman in a small town, and the responsibilities that had kept her tethered to Millbrook long after her peers had left. One quiet afternoon, as the lunch rush died down, George broached a subject that had been on his mind. "Amelia," he began, his voice serious, "have you ever thought about going back to school?" Amelia paused in her task of refilling salt shakers. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but it's not that simple, Mr. Harrison. I have bills to pay, and my mom relies on me to help with her medical expenses." George nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. But you're young, Amelia. You have so much potential. It would be a shame to let it go to waste." Amelia felt a familiar mix of warmth and frustration at his words. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Harrison, but this is my life. It might not be exciting or glamorous, but it's mine. I'm doing the best I can with what I have." George reached out and patted her hand. "I know you are, my dear, and you do it beautifully. I just want you to know that you have options. That's all." As the weeks turned into months, Amelia found herself confiding in George more and more. She told him about her sister Tanya's upcoming visit and her mixed feelings about it. "I love Tanya, I really do," Amelia explained one morning as she topped off George's coffee. "But every time she visits, I feel like I'm being measured against her success. It's hard not to feel like I've fallen short." George listened attentively, his blue eyes full of understanding. "Amelia, my dear, success isn't measured by the size of your paycheck or the title on your business card. It's measured by the lives you touch, kindness you show, and by that measure, you are one of the most successful people I know." Amelia felt tears prick her eyes at his words. She blinked them away quickly, not wanting the other customers to see. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison. That means more than you know." As Tanya's visit approached, Amelia found herself growing increasingly anxious. She confided her fears to George, who listened with his usual patience and understanding. "I just don't want her to be disappointed in me," Amelia admitted one quiet afternoon. "She's done so much with her life, and I'm still here, serving coffee and wiping tables." George leaned forward, his eyes serious. "Amelia, listen to me. You have nothing to be ashamed of. You work hard, you care for your mother, you bring joy to everyone who walks through that door, including me. Don't ever let anyone make you feel less than the incredible woman you are." His words stuck with Amelia, bolstering her confidence as she prepared for Tanya's arrival. When the day finally came, Amelia was surprised to find that many of her fears were unfounded. Tanya was warm and supportive, genuinely interested in Amelia's life and work. One morning during her visit, Tanya accompanied Amelia to the diner for her shift. As they entered, Amelia saw George at his usual table and smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," called out cheerfully. "I'd like you to meet my sister Tanya." George's face lit up. "Ah, the famous Tanya, I've heard so much about you. Please join me for a cup of coffee." As Amelia went about her work, she couldn't help but overhear snippets of their conversation. To her surprise, George spent most of the time singing Amelia's praises. Kindness, her intelligence, unwavering work ethic. Later that evening, as the sisters walked home together, Tanya turned to Amelia with a thoughtful expression. "That Mr. Harrison seems to think very highly of you." Amelia nodded, a warm smile spreading across her face. "He's a good man. He's been coming to the diner for years. Sometimes I think he knows me better than I know myself." Tanya was quiet for a moment and said, "You know, Amelia, I've always worried about you staying in Millbrook. I thought you were settling for less than you deserved. Seeing you today, the way you interact with your customers, the respect and affection they have for you, I think I understand now. You've built something really special here." Amelia felt a weight lift from her shoulders at her sister's words. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen and understood. Tanya. As the weeks passed, Amelia's relationship with George continued to deepen. She found herself sharing things with him that she'd never told anyone else. Fears, her dreams, her regrets. And George, in turn, opened up more about his own life. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rumbled in the distance, George revealed a piece of his past that he'd never shared before. "I had a daughter once," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. "Sarah, she would have been about your age now." Amelia's heart clenched at the pain in his voice. "What happened?" She asked gently. George's eyes met hers, filled with a sorrow that took her breath away. Car accident. She was only 19. It was the hardest thing I've ever been through. Sometimes I think I'm still going through it. Amelia reached across the table, taking his trembling hand in hers. I'm so sorry, Mr. Harrison. I had no idea. George squeezed her hand, a sad smile on his face. It's all right, my dear. It was a long time ago, but sometimes when I look at you, I can't help but wonder if Sarah might have turned out something like you. Kind, intelligent, full of potential. In that moment, Amelia understood the depth of their connection in a way she never had before. She wasn't just a waitress to George, and he wasn't just a customer to her. They had become family. As summer turned to fall, Amelia noticed George's health beginning to decline. His hands shook more frequently, and he often seemed tired and out of breath. Despite her gentle prodding, George brushed off her concerns. Just getting old, my dear, he would say with a wink. It happens to the best of us. But Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She found herself watching George more closely, ready to step in if he needed help. She started preparing his meals with extra care, making sure everything was cut into manageable pieces before serving. One crisp October morning, as golden leaves swirled past the diner windows, George arrived later than usual. Amelia felt her heart skip a beat when she saw him. He looked pale and drawn, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. Mr. Harrison, she said, hurrying over to his table. Are you all right? George managed a weak smile. Just a bit under the weather, Amelia. Nothing to worry about. But Amelia could see the pain in his eyes, the way his hands trembled as he reached for the menu. Without a word, she went to the kitchen and prepared a bowl of chicken soup, not on the menu, but something she knew would comfort. As she set the steaming bowl in front of George, she made a decision. Mr. Harrison, she said firmly, I'm calling Dr. Peterson. You need to be checked out. For once, George didn't argue. He simply nodded, a look of relief crossing his face. Thank you, Amelia, he said softly. What would I do without you? As Amelia made the call, she felt a mix of worry and determination. Whatever was happening with George, she would be there for him, just as he had always been there for her. Little did she know that this moment would be the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. The following weeks were a whirlwind of doctor's appointments and tests for George. Amelia, true to her caring nature, insisted on accompanying him to each visit. She'd rearranged her work schedule, trading shifts and favors with her coworkers to ensure she could be there for George. It was on a chilly November afternoon when they finally received the diagnosis. Amelia sat beside George in Dr. Peterson's office, her hand clasped tightly in his as the doctor delivered the news. I'm afraid it's ALS, Mr. Harrison, Dr. Peterson said, his voice gentle but firm. It's progressing rather quickly, given the symptoms you've described. The words hit Amelia like a physical blow. She'd heard of ALS, knew it was serious, but the reality of what it meant for George was almost too much to bear. She glanced at him, expecting to see fear or despair, but instead found a quiet resignation in his eyes. I suspected as much, George said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. How long? Dr. Peterson hesitated. It's hard to say with certainty, but given the rate of progression, perhaps a year, maybe a little more. Amelia felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. She needed to be strong for George. What can we do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The drive back to George's house was silent, the weight of the diagnosis hanging heavy between them. As Amelia helped George inside, she couldn't help but notice how frail he seemed, how the simple act of moving from his wheelchair to his favorite armchair left him winded. Amelia, my dear, George said once he was settled. We need to talk. Amelia nodded, perching on the edge of the coffee table in front of him. Of course, Mr. Harrison. Whatever you need. George reached out, taking her hands in his. First of all, I want to thank you. Your kindness, your support, it means more to me than you could ever know. Amelia felt tears threatening again. You don't have to thank me, Mr. Harrison. You've been like a father to me. Of course I'm here for you. George smiled, a hint of his usual twinkle returning to his eyes. And you've been like a daughter to me, Amelia, which is why I need to ask you something important. Amelia leaned forward, curious and a little apprehensive. "What is it?" "I'd like you to be my caregiver," George said. "I know it's a lot to ask, and I'll understand if you say no, but there's no one I trust more, no one I'd rather have by my side during this time." Amelia felt a mix of emotions wash over her. Honor, fear, determination. "Mr. Harrison, are you sure? I don't have any training. I don't know if I'd be able to." George squeezed her hands gently. "You have the most important qualification, my dear. You care. The rest we can figure out together." Tears spilled down Amelia's cheeks as she nodded. "Then yes, of course, I'd be honored." The next few months brought significant changes to both their lives. Amelia reduced her hours at the diner, spending most of her time at George's house. She learned to help him with daily tasks that were becoming increasingly difficult. Dressing, eating, even breathing as the disease progressed. Despite the challenges, George maintained his positive outlook and wry sense of humor. He regaled Amelia with stories from his teaching days, shared his vast knowledge of classical music, and even attempted to teach her chess, though she remained hopelessly inept at the game. One evening, as they sat in George's study listening to a Beethoven symphony, George turned to Amelia with a serious expression. "Amelia, my dear, there's something I need to tell you." Amelia muted the music, giving George her full attention. "What is it, Mr. Harrison?" George took a deep breath. "I've made some changes to my will. I want you to know that I've left provisions for your education. When I'm gone, you'll have the means to go back to school to pursue that dream of becoming a social worker." Amelia felt her heart skip a beat. "Mr. Harrison, I don't know what to say. That's incredibly generous, but I can't accept." George held up a hand to stop her. "You can, and you will. Amelia, you have so much to offer the world. I want to make sure you have the opportunity to do so. Promise me you'll use it." Overwhelmed with emotion, Amelia could only nod, tears streaming down her face. As winter turned to spring, George's condition worsened. He was now confined to bed most of the time, relying on a ventilator to breathe. Amelia moved into his spare room, wanting to be close in case he needed her during the night. Despite his declining health, George remained determined to make the most of his time. He insisted on being wheeled out to his garden on sunny days, eyes lighting up at the sight of the first spring blooms. He continued to engage Amelia in deep conversations about life, philosophy, and the future. One warm May afternoon, as they sat in the garden, surrounded by the scent of blooming roses, George turned to Amelia with a wistful smile. "You know, my dear, I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately." Amelia adjusted his blanket, making sure he was comfortable. "What do you mean, Mr. Harrison?" George's gaze was distant, focused on something beyond the garden fence. "I've lived a good life, Amelia. I've known love. I've known loss. I've tried to make a difference in my students' lives. But I wonder, will I be remembered? Will my life have mattered?" Amelia felt her heart clench at the vulnerability in his voice. She knelt beside his wheelchair, taking his hand in hers. "Mr. Harrison, you've changed my life in ways I can't even begin to express. You've shown me kindness, wisdom, and strength. You've believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Your legacy lives on in me and in everyone whose life you've touched." George's eyes misted over as he squeezed Amelia's hand. "Thank you, my dear. You know, I've come to think of you as the daughter I lost. In many ways, you've given me a second chance at fatherhood." Amelia felt tears spill down her cheeks as she leaned forward to hug George gently. "And you've been the father I never had. I love you, Mr. Harrison." As they embraced, Amelia felt a shift in their relationship. The lines between caregiver and patient, friend and family, blurred into something deeper and more meaningful. She knew in that moment that whatever happened, she would cherish this connection for the rest of her life. Little did Amelia know that the biggest surprise was yet to come. As spring bloomed into summer, George's condition continued to deteriorate, but his spirit remained strong. And he had one last gift to give Amelia, a gift that would change her life forever. As summer settled over Millbrook, bringing with it long, warm days and star-filled nights, George's condition continued to decline. Amelia spent most of her time at his bedside, reading to him, playing his favorite classical music, or simply sitting in companionable silence. One particularly hot July afternoon, as the cicadas buzzed outside and a fan whirred softly in the corner of George's room, He turned to Amelia with an unusually serious expression. "Amelia, my dear," said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need you to do something for me." Amelia leaned in closer, alert to his every need. "Of course, Mr. Harrison, anything." George's eyes, though clouded with pain, held a spark of their old mischief. "In my study, there's a small safe behind the painting of the lighthouse. Combination is 7 to 1428. Inside, you'll find an envelope with your name on it. Could you bring it to me, please?" Curious and a little apprehensive, Amelia did as he asked. She found the safe easily and retrieved a thick manila envelope with Amelia Johnson written on it in George's shaky handwriting. Returning to George's bedside, she handed him the envelope. "Here you are, Mr. Harrison. Did I give you some privacy?" George shook his head slowly. "No, my dear. I want you to open it. For you." With trembling hands, Amelia opened the envelope. Inside, she found a stack of legal documents and a handwritten letter. As she began to read, her eyes widened in disbelief. "Mr. Harrison," she gasped, This can't be right. It says you're leaving me your house, and a substantial amount of money. This must be a mistake." George reached out and took her hand, his grip weak but determined. "It's no mistake, Amelia. I meant what I said about providing for your education, but I realized that wasn't enough. I want to make sure you have every opportunity to build the life you deserve." Tears spilled down Amelia's cheeks as the full impact of George's generosity hit her. "But Mr. Harrison, this is too much. I can't accept this." George's eyes were firm as he replied, "You can, and you will. Amelia, you've given me so much these past months. You've been my caregiver, my friend, the daughter I lost. This is my way of saying thank you, and of ensuring that your kindness and compassion can continue to touch lives long after I'm gone." Overwhelmed, Amelia could only nod, clutching the documents to her chest as she wept quietly. George continued, his voice growing weaker but no less resolute. "I want you to use this gift to pursue your dreams, Amelia. Go back to school, become the social worker you've always wanted to be, and then use your skills and your heart to help others, just as you've helped me." Amelia took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "I promise, Mr. Harrison, I'll make you proud." George smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You already have, my dear. You already have." The next few weeks passed in a blur of emotion for Amelia. She continued to care for George, whose health was failing rapidly, while also grappling with the enormous change that awaited her. She found herself torn between grief at George's impending loss and excitement for the future he had made possible. One quiet evening in early August, as Amelia sat by George's bedside reading aloud from his favorite book, she noticed his breathing had become more labored than usual. Setting the book aside, she took his hand gently. "Mr. Harrison, are you comfortable? Do you need anything?" George's eyes fluttered open, focusing on her face with effort. "Amelia," he whispered, "my dear Amelia, I think it's time." Amelia felt her heart constrict, even as she tried to keep her voice steady. "Time for what, Mr. Harrison?" A serene smile spread across George's face. "Time to say goodbye, my dear. Before I go, I want you to know how much you've meant to me. You've brought light and joy to my final days. Thank you." Tears streaming down her face, Amelia leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to George's forehead. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison, for everything. I love you." George's eyes closed, his smile still in place. "And I love you, my dear. Now, go change the world." With those words, George took his final breath, slipping away peacefully with Amelia by his side. The days that followed were a whirlwind of grief and activity for Amelia. She arranged George's funeral, a simple but beautiful service, attended by many of his former students and colleagues. She was touched by the number of lives George had impacted, each person sharing stories of his kindness and wisdom. As the executor of George's will, Amelia found herself thrust into a world she knew little about. Lawyers, banks, property transfers. It was overwhelming, but she was determined to honor George's wishes. When the dust settled, Amelia found herself the owner of a beautiful house, and with a bank account balance that made her head spin. But more than that, she had a promise to keep. With trembling hands, she filled out the application for the local community college's social work program. As she sealed the envelope, she whispered, "This is for you, Mr. Harrison." As fall arrived, bringing with it crisp air and colorful leaves, Amelia stood in front of the mirror in what was now her house. She straightened her new blouse, took a deep breath, and picked up her backpack. It was her first day of college. As she locked the front door behind her, she paused for a moment, looking up at the clear blue sky. She could almost hear George's voice in her head, encouraging her, believing in her. With a smile and a determined set to her shoulders, Amelia set off down the street. She had a world to change, and she was ready to begin. The crisp autumn air filled Amelia's lungs as she walked across the community college campus. It had been 3 months since George's passing, and each day brought a mix of grief and excitement for the new chapter in her life. Adjusting to college life at 35 was not without its challenges. Amelia often found herself surrounded by classmates nearly half her age, their energy and enthusiasm both invigorating and intimidating. But she was determined to make the most of this opportunity, throwing herself into her studies with a passion that surprised even her. Her first class of the day was Introduction to Social Work. As she settled into her seat, Amelia couldn't help but smile, remembering George's words, "Go change the world." She opened her notebook, ready to absorb every bit of knowledge that would help her fulfill that promise. Professor Martinez, a petite woman with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, began the lecture. "Social work is about more than just helping people," she said, her voice filled with passion. "It's about empowering them, about recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every individual." Amelia felt a thrill run through her. This was exactly why she was here, why she had chosen this path. She thought of George, how he had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. As the weeks passed, Amelia found herself thriving in her new environment. She excelled in her classes, her life experience often providing unique insights that her younger classmates lacked. She joined study groups, participated in class discussions, and even volunteered at a local community center, eager to put her newfound knowledge into practice. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were nights when the coursework seemed overwhelming, when doubts crept in, and she questioned whether she was truly up to the task. On those nights, Amelia would sit in George's, now her, study, surrounded by his books and memories, and draw strength from his faith in her. One particularly challenging evening, as Amelia struggled with a difficult assignment, she found herself talking out loud to George. "I don't know if I can do this, Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice quavering. "Maybe I'm in over my head." As if in response, her eyes fell on a framed quote on the desk, one she had never noticed before. It read, "Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes courage is the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, 'I will try again tomorrow.'" Amelia felt a warmth spread through her chest. It was exactly what she needed to hear, exactly what George would have told her. With renewed determination, she turned back to her assignment, ready to face the challenge head-on. As the semester progressed, Amelia's world began to expand in ways she had never imagined. She formed close friendships with several of her classmates, finding common ground despite their age difference. She attended seminars and workshops, soaking up knowledge and making connections in the field she hoped to enter. One day, as she was leaving the community center after her volunteer shift, Amelia ran into Emily, a woman she recognized from her neighborhood. Emily looked tired and stressed, crying toddler on her hip and an older child tugging at her sleeve. "Are you okay?" Amelia asked, concerned. Emily sighed heavily. "Just struggling a bit. My husband lost his job and I'm trying to balance work and the kids, and it all just feels like too much sometimes." Amelia felt a familiar spark of compassion, the same one that had drawn her to care for George. "Have you considered reaching out to social services? There are programs that might be able to help." Emily shook her head. "I wouldn't know where to start, and honestly, I'm a little embarrassed to ask for help." Amelia smiled gently. "There's no shame in needing support, Emily. That's what these services are for. If you'd like, I could help you navigate the process. I'm studying social work, and I'd be happy to assist." The relief on Emily's face was palpable. "Really? That would be amazing. Thank you, Amelia." As Amelia helped Emily fill out the necessary forms and connect with the right resources over the next few weeks, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was why she had chosen this path. why George had believed in her so strongly. She was making a real difference in someone's life. The semester flew by, and before Amelia knew it, she was facing her final exams. She studied tirelessly, drawing on all she had learned both in the classroom and through her volunteer work. When she received her grades, all A's, she felt a surge of pride and gratitude. That evening, Amelia sat in the garden George had loved so much, now blooming with spring flowers. She held her grade report in one hand and a framed photo of George in the other. "We did it, Mr. Harrison," she said softly, tears of joy streaming down her face. "This is just the beginning, but we did it. Thank you for believing in me, for giving me this chance. I promise I'll make the most of it." As the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Amelia felt a sense of peace wash over her. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt. But she also knew she was on the right path, fulfilling not just her own dreams, but also honoring George's legacy. Amelia looked up at the darkening sky, a soft smile on her face. "I'm changing the world, Mr. Harrison," she whispered, "one life at a time." As she stood to go inside, Amelia felt a gentle breeze caress her cheek. For a moment, just a moment, it felt like George's hand giving her one last gesture of support and love. With a heart full of gratitude and hope, Amelia stepped into her home, ready to face whatever the future might bring. The next morning, as Amelia prepared for another day of classes, she paused by the mirror in the hallway. The woman who looked back at her was different from the waitress who had served coffee to a kindly disabled man all those months ago. This woman stood taller, her eyes bright with purpose and determination. She picked up her backpack, feeling the weight of her books and the responsibility they represented. As she opened the front door, she took one last look around the house that had once been George's and was now her home. On a small table by the door, she had placed the note George had left her along with his bequest. She read it every morning, drawing strength and inspiration from his word. "Dearest Amelia, by the time you read this, I will be gone. But I leave you with more than just material possessions. I leave you with my faith in you, my belief in your potential, and my hope for your future. You have a rare gift, Amelia, the ability to see the best in people, to offer kindness without expectation of return. The world needs more people like you, especially in the field of social work. Use this gift wisely. Let it guide you in your studies and in your career. Remember that every life you touch, every person you help, is a tribute to the kindness you've shown me. You've been the daughter I lost, the friend I needed, and the caregiver who made my final days a joy rather than a burden. Now it's time for you to spread your wings and fly. Change the world, Amelia. I know you can do it. With all my love and gratitude, George." Amelia touched the note gently, then squared her shoulders and stepped out into the morning sunshine. She had classes to attend, knowledge to gain, and a world to change. As she walked down the street, nodding and smiling at her neighbors, Amelia felt a sense of excitement for what the day might bring. She knew that somewhere, George was watching over her, cheering her on, and she was ready to learn, ready to grow, and ready to make a difference. One life at a time. The journey that had begun with a simple act of kindness in a diner had led her here, to this moment, to this new beginning. Amelia Johnson, once a waitress, now a social work student, and always a compassionate soul, set off to face her future. She carried with her the lessons of her past, the support of those who believed in her, and the determination to honor George's legacy by becoming the best version of herself. As she disappeared around the corner, the morning sun glinted off the windows of her home, as if George himself was winking at her, sending her off with one last gesture of love and encouragement. Amelia's story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning.